The city of Los Angeles breathes a different kind of air after midnight. It's a mixture of cool desert wind, stale exhaust, and the faint electric hum of a million lonely dreams. On a street called Hulin Terrace, tucked into a tired corner of the sprawling metropolis, that air was about to be choked with the metallic tang of slaughter. The afternoon of December 12th, 1995, was hot and still. The sun baked the graffiti on the brick walls of the old apartment buildings, making the colors bleed. Inside one of those buildings, on the second floor, a man named Omar Kane was drowning on dry land. He was a plumber, a man used to the satisfying heft of a wrench in his hand, but now his hands were slick with his own blood, and they trembled as he clutched the telephone receiver. He managed to dial his boss, a man named Sal. The words came out in a ragged gasp, a sound torn from the very lining of his lungs. "Sal, it's Omar. I can't make it in. I've been stabbed." His breath hitched, a rattling sound in his own chest. He squeezed his eyes shut against the dizzying pain. 6 times, I think. A pause, long enough for Sal's confused questions to echo unheard on the other end of the line. Then Omar's voice returned, a frantic whisper now laced with a terror that was not for himself. "There's a murder at my house. Sal, there's a murder. 3 people are dead. You have to... Please, save me." The call ripped through the afternoon calm. It was the kind of message that turns a routine day into a career-defining nightmare. The sirens wailed, converging on Hulin Terrace with a rising shriek that made curtains twitch in neighboring windows. When the first LAPD officers kicked in the apartment door, they were not prepared. No amount of training could prepare them for this. It wasn't a crime scene. It was an abattoir. It was a Jackson Pollock canvas painted in shades of arterial red and Venus black. Blood was everywhere. It was a fine, atomized mist on the ceiling. It was sprayed in long, sweeping arcs across the dingy beige walls. It pooled in thick, coagulating puddles on the linoleum floor, so deep that it squelched under their boots, and it was tracked through the apartment in a series of bare footprints, a ghastly trail leading from one horror to the next. The scene was an articulation of pure, undiluted rage. A violence so total it felt like a physical presence in the room, a weight pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. One of the younger officers, seeing the carnage, turned and retched in the hallway. The lead detective, a man named Mike Corrigan, had seen 2 decades of LA's worst, but this was different. This had a texture, a vicious intimacy that made his skin crawl. As his forensic team began their grim work, a small, strange detail emerged from the chaos. In some of the bloody footprints, there was a distinct repeating imprint. It was a perfect circle with a tiny dot in the middle. The mark of a button, maybe from a pair of cargo pants or a work shirt. It was a bizarrely mundane detail in a landscape of utter barbarity. Corrigan latched onto it. It was a clue, a breadcrumb, a way to start mapping this hellscape. The victims were the Miller family, the residents of the apartment. Brenda Miller, the mother, was found slumped in the hallway, a heap of torn fabric and violated flesh. She had been the last to die. In the master bedroom, they found her husband, Hank, and their 17-year-old daughter, Sarah. They were tangled together on the floor in a pool of blood so vast it had soaked through the cheap carpet and was likely dripping into the apartment below. They had been dead for hours. The killer's work had been a frenzy of stabbing, a storm of hatred directed at their bodies. Brenda had been stabbed 22 times, a brutal overkill attack. Hank had been stabbed 9 times. Sarah also 9 times. One of the wounds to Sarah's neck was so deep, so savage, that her head was attached to her body by little more than a sliver of skin and spine. It was a wound of pure annihilation. The preliminary investigation suggested the killer had entered through a kitchen window that faced a back alley, but this was no botched burglary. The television was still there. A cheap laptop sat on a desk. A wallet with cash and credit cards was on the dresser, untouched. This wasn't about property. This was personal. This was an extermination. And then there was the other strange detail, the one that sent a chill down even Corrigan's seasoned spine. All 3 bodies had been covered. Brenda was draped with a coat. Hank and Sarah were covered by the bed's comforter, pulled from the mattress and thrown over their bodies. It was an act that felt almost considerate, but it wasn't. Corrigan had seen it before. It was an old superstition. A folk belief. A killer who covers the faces of their victims does so because they fear the dead. They fear the vacant, accusing stare of the ghost they have just created. This suggested the killer knew the Millers, knew them well enough to fear their spectral retribution. The weapon, forensics determined, was nothing special. It was a common fruit knife, a thin, paring-style blade, the kind you could buy for $5 at any supermarket. It was a weapon of convenience, not of planning. Or was it? The questions piled up. Neighbors, when questioned, recalled hearing a furious argument around 3 o'clock that morning. A man's voice, a woman's voice, shouting, screaming. But this was Hulin Terrace. Domestic disputes were the building's nightly soundtrack. They had rolled over and gone back to sleep. This gave the police a timeline. Hank and Sarah had died sometime after 3 in the morning, but the most disturbing, most mind-bending piece of the puzzle was Brenda. She was a nurse. She worked the night shift at a downtown hospital. Her time card showed she hadn't clocked out until 7 in the morning and likely wouldn't have gotten home until after 8. The coroner's estimate placed her time of death in the late afternoon just before Omar Kane made his desperate phone call. The implication was staggering. It meant the killer had murdered the father and daughter in the pre-dawn darkness, and then he had waited. He had remained in that apartment, in that charnel house, surrounded by the cooling bodies and the overwhelming stench of blood for more than 13 hours. He had waited in the silence. He had waited for Brenda to come home. What kind of mind does that? A mind consumed by a fit of rage flees. It panics. It doesn't sit down and patiently wait for its next victim. This was cold. This was methodical. This was a predator who had set a trap and was willing to wait all day for his prey to walk into it. He was either obsessed with killing Brenda specifically, or he knew the precise number of people who lived in this apartment and was grimly determined to complete his collection. This wasn't just a killer who knew the family. This was a killer with a mission. And the only person left to explain it was Omar Kane, the survivor, the tenant, the man who had been stabbed 6 times and lived to tell the tale. He was their key witness, their only link to the phantom in the apartment. And as the evidence began to mount, he was also their prime suspect. From his sterile hospital bed, surrounded by the beeping of monitors and the antiseptic smell that couldn't quite erase the memory of warm blood, Omar Kane told his story. His voice was weak, but his eyes were clear. He was a veteran. He had seen combat. He knew how to stay calm in the face of death. He said he'd heard the shouting early that morning, the fight between Sarah and her parents. It wasn't the first time. He'd learned to tune it out. He stayed in his room, dozing off and on. Around 8 o'clock, he finally got up to leave for work. He opened his bedroom door, and his world was reduced to a flash of polished steel. A man, a stranger, was in the hallway, and he came at Omar with a knife. There was no time to think, only to react. He said they struggled, a desperate, grunting dance of life and death in the narrow space. Omar felt the blade bite into his arm, his side, his shoulder, sharp, searing jolts of pain, but his training, buried for years, surged to the surface. He got a hand on the man's wrist, twisting, using his larger frame to force the man off balance. They crashed against the wall, and the knife clattered to the floor. Omar said he kicked it away. He had the man pinned, helpless. He said he thought about it, about ending him right there. The man had tried to kill him, but reason, or maybe just exhaustion, took over. Instead, he said, he just punched the man once, a hard, sharp blow to the face. They were both on the floor then, gasping for air, bleeding. Omar said he looked the killer in the eyes and spoke. "You and I have no beef," he'd said, his voice a low growl. "Why are you doing this? Let's just both walk away. You go your way, I'll go to my room." And in the surreal, bloody aftermath of their fight, the killer had simply nodded. Omar scrambled back into his room, slammed the door, and jammed a chair under the knob. He grabbed the heaviest pipe wrench he owned, holding it like a club. He was terrified the man would change his mind, would come crashing through the door. He peered through the crack between the door and the frame, watching the man pace the living room like a caged animal. And then, in the late afternoon, he heard the front door open. He heard Brenda Miller's cheerful greeting. He heard it cut off by a sudden sharp gasp. He heard the sound of a struggle, of furniture being overturned. He heard Brenda's screams, her pleas, her cries for mercy that turned into choked, gurgling sobs. And then he heard the final, terrible silence. He knew she was dead. He said he stayed there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, his heart hammering against his ribs. Only when he was sure the killer was finally gone did he dare to reach for the phone. Detective Corrigan listened to the story, his face an unreadable mask. It was a hell of a tale of survival, of courage. It was also a tale riddled with holes you could drive a truck through. When the crime scene unit had processed the apartment, Omar's room had been locked from the inside. They had to call a locksmith to get it open, and inside that locked room, on the floor near his bed, they found a blood-stained fruit knife. Omar's story was that he disarmed the killer in the hallway. How did the knife get inside his locked room? And then there were the bigger questions. If he had truly bested the killer, why hide? A decorated veteran, a man who had faced down an armed attacker, now cowering in his room for hours. And why would the killer, his face now seen, his identity compromised, simply allow the only witness to his massacre to live? And the biggest question of all, the phone call. A man witnesses a triple murder, is nearly killed himself, and his first instinct is to call his boss to request a sick day. It defied all logic. It reeked of a fabricated alibi. The final damning piece of evidence came back from the lab. The bloody footprints at the scene, the ones with the strange circular button imprint. Forensics had taken Omar's work boots from the hospital. The tread was worn, but the pattern was clear. It was a perfect match. A new theory began to form in Corrigan's mind. A darker, simpler explanation. Maybe there was no phantom. Maybe the phantom was Omar Kane. Maybe he was infatuated with the pretty 17-year-old girl who lived down the hall, an obsession that turned deadly. Maybe Sarah had rejected him, or maybe her father, Hank, had caught them together, and Omar, a powerful man with military training, had snapped. He'd killed the father and daughter in a fit of rage. Then he'd realized the mother, Brenda, was still due home. So he waited. He waited all day, and when she arrived, he killed her too. Then, to complete his ruse, he inflicted a series of shallow, non-lethal wounds on himself and concocted his heroic, unbelievable story. It was a neat theory, it fit most of the facts, but it had one persistent, nagging flaw. If he had killed 2 people in a rage, the smart move was to run. Why risk everything by waiting 13 hours for a third victim? It was a gamble that didn't quite fit the profile. The investigation stalled, caught between a phantom killer and a suspicious hero. The media, hungry for a villain, latched onto Omar. His face was plastered on the news, his story dissected and ridiculed. In the court of public opinion, he was already a monster, a brutal killer hiding behind a flimsy veil of lies. Corrigan couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. He sent his team back to the apartment on Hulin Terrace, telling them to tear it apart. "Look for something that doesn't belong," he ordered. "Something we missed." And they did. The place was a ruin of fingerprint dust and chemical sprays, but in their meticulous second search, they found it. In the hallway where the forensics team had already documented the bloody footprints, a detective noticed faint but unmistakable wipe marks on the linoleum. Someone had tried to mop up the blood. They found the mop in a hall closet. Its fibers were stiff with dried, blackened blood. The killer had tried to clean up his tracks, but in his haste he had only left a bigger, more obvious clue. And then came the breakthrough. In the master bedroom, tucked away under the corner of a heavy area rug, they found more bloody footprints. These were from a different kind of shoe, an athletic shoe, and the prints did not belong to Hank, Brenda, Sarah, or Omar Kane. Nearby, on a patch of carpet they had initially missed, they found it. A single tiny, almost invisible drop of blood. It was so small it could have been anything. But the lab test was definitive. The DNA did not match anyone in the Miller family, and it did not match Omar Kane. Suddenly, Omar's story didn't sound so crazy. He had said he'd slashed the attacker's face. This tiny drop of blood was the physical proof. The phantom was real. Corrigan felt a surge of adrenaline followed by a wave of frustration. They had vindicated their suspect, only to be left with a ghost. The case was right back where it started, at a dead end. They went back to the hospital and questioned Omar again. This time he was more forthcoming. He knew he was the prime suspect, knew he was fighting for his life. He dug deep into his memory of that horrible morning. He remembered the words he'd heard during the argument between Sarah and her parents. He couldn't make out full sentences, but fragments came back to him. Boy, girl, money. And then he remembered something else, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. 2 nights before the murders, on the evening of December 10th, he had heard another argument. It was Sarah and her parents again. But this time, there was another man's voice, a younger man's voice. He was shouting too. Omar had assumed it was Sarah's boyfriend. This was the key that unlocked the whole damn case. The investigation pivoted, turning its full attention to the life of Sarah Miller. They got a warrant for her laptop, for her phone records, and on her computer, buried in a folder labeled English Lit, they found it. A series of emails, chat logs, and unsent letters. They detailed a secret, passionate, and deeply troubled relationship with a man named David Chen, one of her teachers at her high school. The story that unfolded was a classic, tragic tale of forbidden love. David Chen was 29, an immigrant who had dedicated his life to education. Sarah was a bright, rebellious 17-year-old. They had fallen in love. It was a relationship they had kept hidden for over a year. But somehow, her parents, Hank and Brenda, had found out, and they were, according to Sarah's writings, furious. They were vehemently opposed to the relationship. Interviews with David Chen's friends and colleagues confirmed it. They knew about Sarah. They knew he was in love. They also knew it was causing him immense stress. The police started tracking David Chen's movements. His school records showed he had called in sick on December 12th, the day of the murders. He had returned to school the next day, and a colleague noted he had a fresh, angry-looking gash on his cheek. He'd claimed he'd been in a minor car accident, an excuse that now sent a jolt of ice through Corrigan's veins. After that, one day, David Chen had taken another week off work, citing personal reasons. It was too much to be a coincidence. When police went to his apartment, it was empty. The landlord said he hadn't seen him in days. His dog, a small terrier he was devoted to, was gone. This wasn't a man taking a personal week. This was a man on the run. Corrigan put out an all-points bulletin. He had teams scouring the city. The tip came in less than 12 hours later. An officer on patrol had spotted David Chen's car parked outside a house in a quiet suburb. It was his sister's house. When the SWAT team stormed the property, they found David Chen in the garage. He was frantically loading clothes, blankets, and his dog into his car. He was seconds away from disappearing. They caught him just in time. In a duffel bag in the trunk of his car, they found them. A pair of Nike running shoes. They had been recently, but imperfectly washed. Under the luminol spray, they lit up like a Christmas tree. The faint traces of blood were everywhere. The tread pattern was a perfect, indisputable match for the unidentified, bloody footprints found in the Miller's apartment. The DNA from the blood on the shoes was a match for Hank, Brenda, and Sarah Miller. Confronted with the shoes, with the undeniable science, David Chen collapsed. He slumped against the side of his car as if his bones had turned to dust. "I'm a dead man," he whispered to the concrete floor. "I'm a dead man." At the station, he was a stone wall. He refused to talk, refused to cooperate. He just sat there, staring at a fixed point on the wall, occasionally screaming at the detectives to just give him a bullet and end his misery. The interrogation went on for hours, a fruitless exercise in frustration. He only broke, only shattered into a million pieces when Detective Corrigan walked into the room and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It contained one line of text, printed from Sarah Miller's computer. The full, sordid story came pouring out of him then, a torrent of love, rage, grief, and regret. David Chen was an immigrant success story. His family had fled war, and he had made a life for himself through sheer will and intelligence. He was a dedicated biology teacher. He met Sarah when she was a freshman in his class. They connected on an intellectual and emotional level. The relationship grew slowly, carefully. When he was briefly transferred to a school in another city, they maintained their love through letters and late-night phone calls. It was a period of intense, painful longing for both of them. Sarah had begged him to come back to LA, and he had immediately pulled every string he could, taking a less prestigious position at another school just to be near her. Their physical relationship had begun then. He was utterly devoted to her. He was her tutor, her confidant, her driver, her world. But her parents, Hank and Brenda, were a cancer on their love. When they found out, they had reacted with a fury that terrified Sarah. They locked her in her room. They took her phone. They did everything they could to keep them apart. On December 10th, just 2 days before the murders, a desperate Sarah had called David from a friend's phone. She begged him to come over, to talk to her parents, to plead their case. The meeting had been a catastrophe. It was a hurricane of insults and threats. Hank and Brenda had even slapped Sarah across the face in front of him. David had gotten on his knees on their living room floor. He had begged them to stop. He told them he loved their daughter, that he wanted to spend his life with her. And that's when Hank and Brenda had revealed their true colors. They laid out their terms. They demanded he buy a house as a betrothal gift, a down payment on their daughter's future. It was an impossible demand. Then came the threats. They told him to hand over his teaching license. They would hold it hostage. If he couldn't produce the house, they would go to the school board, to the police. They would ruin his career, have him arrested for his relationship with a minor. Then they offered an alternative, a cash payment, $500,000, cold hard cash as compensation, a sum that could buy a nice house outright in 1995. What David didn't know, what the police had only just discovered from financial records, was the truth about the Millers. Sarah was adopted. Hank Miller's construction business had gone belly up years ago, and he'd become a degenerate gambler, chasing his losses in backroom card games. Brenda, too, was addicted to the click-clack of mahjong tiles, losing money they didn't have. They were drowning in debt. They saw their daughter's older professional boyfriend not as a threat, but as a winning lottery ticket. They weren't protecting their daughter. They were pimping her out. David saw it clearly. He was just an ordinary man being treated like a fat wallet, a mark to be fleeced. His rage had been immense. And in his rage, his love had curdled into suspicion. His anger had turned on Sarah. He felt she hadn't defended him. She had just stood there crying while her parents laid out their disgusting terms. His mind, now a fertile ground for paranoia, seized on something Sarah had mentioned weeks before. A new guy she had met at her part-time job at a coffee shop. A guy she seemed to laugh with a little too easily. He started to believe she was in on it. That she was playing him. That their love was just a long con to get her parents paid. On the day of the murder, Sarah and David had one last phone call. It lasted for over an hour. A call full of tears and recriminations. Sarah told him it was hopeless. Her parents would never agree. She told him to meet her that night in the back alley to talk. But David heard something else. He heard a trap being set. Convinced he was being lured into a final, humiliating shakedown, his mind snapped. He went to a supermarket and bought a fruit knife. His plan was vague, born of rage and despair. He would go to the house, he would confront them, and if this was the end, he would take them all with him. He had followed Sarah's instructions, climbed the fire escape, slid through the open kitchen window she had left for him. He went straight to the master bedroom, a storm of fury in his heart. And he had found Hank Miller, sleeping peacefully, and he had stabbed him. The noise had woken Sarah. She had run into the room, her face a mask of horror. But in his twisted, paranoid state, he saw not his love, but his betrayer. He saw the girl who had allowed her parents to treat him like dirt. The girl who he believed was about to abandon him for someone else, and he had turned the knife on her. As she lay dying, she had raised a single shaky hand and extended her middle finger, a final silent fuck you to the man who had destroyed her. He had waited for Brenda. He didn't know she was at work. He was startled by Omar Kane. He attacked thinking Omar was part of the family, another person who had to be silenced. But Omar had fought back. In the strange, bloody aftermath of their fight, David had made the pact with him. He was exhausted, he was bleeding, he was running on pure adrenaline, and the crash was coming. He sat in the living room while Omar hid, and he had actually fallen asleep for a while, a brief, nightmarish slumber in a house of the dead. Brenda Miller's return had woken him. He had attacked her the moment she stepped through the door. The mystery of the second knife was simple. After Omar had taken his, He had gone to the kitchen in a daze and found another identical fruit knife sitting in the dish rack. A chilling, fatal coincidence. The final, devastating truth came from the single line of text on the paper Detective Corrigan had shown him, the line that had shattered his composure. It was from an unsent email Sarah had written to her best friend, saved as a draft on her computer. It read, "He doesn't know it yet, but tonight I will elope with the one I love most." The realization hit David Chen like a physical blow. He had misunderstood everything, every single thing. She wasn't betraying him. She wasn't luring him into a trap. She was planning to run away with him. The unlocked window, the meeting in the alley, it was all for their escape. He had murdered the girl who loved him, the girl who was choosing him over her monstrous family. The sound he made was not human. It was the sound of a soul being ripped in half. He was so completely broken, so utterly consumed by the catastrophic weight of his mistake, that he had simply curled up on the sofa in the interrogation room and fallen into a deep, comatose sleep. David Chen's rage, born from a love that was twisted by greed and suffocated by a fatal misunderstanding, had cost 4 people their lives and futures. In 1998, the Supreme Court of California sentenced him to death. The sentence was carried out without delay. The Hulin Terrace murder case became a dark legend in the city of Los Angeles. It was more than just a lurid crime story. It was a profound and brutal parable about the destructive power of anger, the corrosiveness of greed, and the tragic, irreparable damage that can be done when we fail to listen, when we fail to trust, and when we allow our own demons to convince us that love looks like betrayal. It was a story about a girl who deserved a future, and a man who threw his away in a single, nightmarish act of violence, all because he couldn't see the truth that was right in front of him.